20 years ago, Dr. Gideon Marsh had, with his own hands, officially recorded the mysterious natural extinction of a rare, moon-colored butterfly species, the Sierra silverwing, in a pristine valley in the Sierra Nevada mountains as a case that no one could solve. As one of the most respected ecologists of his time, he had explained this tragic event as the inevitable result of climate change, pollution, and the cruel, unpredictable cycle of nature. The scientific community had accepted this explanation, the valley had lost its protected status, and it had been forgotten. The only culprit in that case, the perfect, diabolical intelligence behind that natural extinction, was he himself. And now, 20 years later, a new technology, combined with the curious eyes of a new generation of scientists, was proving that that natural extinction was actually a perfectly planned biological murder. And the murder weapon, that perfectly designed killer, was still at the scene of the crime, innocently flapping its wings. Gideon Marsh's present life consisted of the quiet and patient payment of a penance. He was in his late 60s, his face was deepened by the wisdom of the rains and the sun of the Pacific Northwest, and his eyes, which had once looked through the cold glass of microscopes with an analytical sharpness, had lost that edge and were now filled with a calm understanding that understood the language of the trees and animals. He was no longer a genius who wrote reports for private companies. He was a senior park ranger in one of the country's largest and most pristine national parks. He had dedicated his life to protecting, understanding, and explaining to others the delicate balance he had once destroyed. That morning, too, he was guiding a group of university students on a mossy path in the shadow of giant sequoia trees. His voice was as calm and deep as the forest's own whisper. He was explaining to them how an ecosystem was a complex web connected by invisible threads, how the extinction of a single species could make the entire web tremble. Nature, he said, showing them a dry leaf in his hand, cannot be controlled. It can only be understood and respected. The moment you try to control it is the moment you lose. This was his new philosophy, a lesson that the arrogant young genius he was 20 years ago had learned in a bitter way. The students listened to him with admiration, as if he were a living encyclopedia of nature. No one knew that this wise, gentle man had once dared to play God, and with a small apocalypse of his own creation, had turned a paradise into a hell. This calm, carefully woven world of penance was shattered that evening, like an earthquake, by a scientific article that appeared on the screen of his laptop in the small, modest ranger's lodge. The article had been shared on an online pre-publication platform by a young, ambitious biologist specializing in genetic tracking and invasive species, named Dr. Kenji Tanaka. Its title was provocative: An Impossible Resurrection, Evidence of a Bioengineered Lepidoptera, butterfly species. As his heart began to beat like a cold hammer in his chest, Gideon began to read the article. Tanaka was conducting research in that famous, now privately owned valley where the Sierra silverwing had disappeared 20 years ago. And there he had discovered that the silverwing had mysteriously returned. But the real bombshell was not this. When Tanaka analyzed the DNA of these times returned butterflies, he had encountered something impossible. The genetic code of the butterfly contained a complex artificial genetic sequence, synthetic markers that should never be found in nature. This species had not been resurrected. This species was not natural from the beginning. It had been created in a laboratory. Gideon got up from his chair and looked out the window at the dark forest. It couldn't be. It was supposed to disappear. 20 years ago, when he had designed that dusk moth for that ruthless corporate entity, the Consortium, which wanted that valley for the priceless mineral deposits beneath it, he had calculated everything. The moth would look almost identical to the silverwing, but it would be much more aggressive. It would consume all its food sources, and it would silently, naturally, push it to extinction. And, most importantly, the moth would be sterile. It carried a hidden genetic time bomb that would cause the population to collapse after 3 generations, Thus, after completing its mission, it would also disappear without leaving a trace. A perfect biological crime. But nature was more complex than his arrogant equations. He had not taken into account that small, statistically insignificant 1 in a million mutation. A tiny percentage of the moths had undergone a mutation that disabled that genetic time bomb, had survived, and had continued to breed secretly for 20 years as the new fake masters of that valley. And now, Dr. Kenji Tanaka had caught one of those survivors and had read that lie, that great sin, in its genetic code. For the first time in his life, Gideon did not know what to do. But he did not have much time to think. A few days later, that encrypted satellite phone which had been silent for 20 years rang with a shrill sound. The caller was the cold, pragmatic lawyer of the consortium, Ms. Evelyn Reed, his contact person from 20 years ago. "We've read the article, Gideon," Reed said, her voice as emotionless as an ice sheet. "It seems your little project has left a residue." It was not an accusation, it was a statement of fact. This young man named Tanaka is asking too many questions, and the answers he is finding could prove that we did not just buy a delisted piece of land, but that we organized the extinction of a species. This is an unacceptable risk. Reed paused for a moment, and then that deadly ultimatum came. "You created the problem, Gideon. You will solve it. You will go to that valley, you will silence that researcher, and you will destroy all the evidence, all the samples he has. Or else we will have to write a new report explaining how not just a butterfly species, but also a curious biologist, naturally disappeared in that valley 20 years ago. Is that understood?"
Gideon's peaceful sanctuary, in that moment, was completely shattered. He was no longer a protector, a wise man. He was, once again, being forced to transform into that amoral, dangerous monster of his past. He took a leave of absence from his job at the park for personal reasons. And he set off for that valley he had sworn he would never return to, for that hell he had created himself. He was no longer a protector of nature. He was once again being forced to be its executioner. He was trapped in a cruel purgatory between his past crime and his present morality. When he arrived in that valley, he saw the traces of 20 years, and at the same time that nothing had changed. The consortium had not rushed to extract the minerals. They had quietly waited for the value of the land to increase. The valley still had that wild beauty he knew. But now, that beauty was like a monument, reminding him of the magnitude of the sin he had committed. He went to Dr. Tanaka's small, prefabricated research station in the guise of an experienced, semi-retired ecologist, sent by the university to assist his project. Kenji Tanaka was a man in his early 30s, intelligent, energetic, and passionate about his work. When he saw the legendary Dr. Gideon Marsh before him, he first felt a great respect and excitement. For him, it was an honor. And thus, that tense, intellectual cat-and-mouse game began. Gideon used all his deep knowledge and experience to discredit Tanaka's findings. He suggested that that synthetic genetic sequence could be a mutation caused by a pesticide carried by the wind from a nearby agricultural area, or that it could be the result of a contamination in the laboratory. He produced a clever, highly logical-sounding counterargument for every piece of evidence. And Tanaka, in the beginning, approached this legendary scientist with respect. But over time, he began to be disturbed by Gideon's constant skepticism, this constant effort to explain away the data. It was as if Gideon was not searching for the truth. On the contrary, it was as if he was trying to cover it up. Meanwhile, Miss Reed's men were watching their every move from a distance, putting pressure on Gideon with encrypted messages to solve the problem as soon as possible. The breaking point of the game came when Tanaka, after weeks of work on that artificial genetic sequence, made a breakthrough. He had not only proven that that sequence was artificial, he had also discovered that that sequence was written with a specific algorithm, a specific logic. That is, it carried a signature. This, he said excitedly, showing Gideon that complex sequence of letters and numbers on the computer screen in the laboratory, is not just a random genetic code. It is so complex, so unique, that it is like a signature, the fingerprint of the engineer who created it. In that moment, Gideon looked at that sequence on the screen and felt his blood freeze. He recognized that signature. It was the foolish, conceited signature that the arrogant young genius he was had put under his work 20 years ago. That sequence did not consist of meaningless letters. It was an encrypted, protein-translated copy of a specific section of Gideon's own DNA. Tanaka had not just found the proof of bioengineering. He had found the key to identifying the creator. Before Gideon could say a word, they heard the howling of a rising wind from outside, and then that familiar, that terrible crackle. The men of Reed, tired of waiting, had implemented the crudest, most ruthless solution. They had set the valley on fire, disguised as a natural forest fire. The flames, licking the dry grass and pine trees, were advancing towards their small research station with incredible speed. As the flames, like the tongues of hell, licked that small wooden laboratory, Gideon and Tanaka were running for their lives. The suffocating smoke of the fire, its unbearable heat, had surrounded them. As a park ranger, Gideon knew forest fires. But this was different. This was not a natural fire. This was an arson started from strategic points to destroy a specific target, that is, them and the evidence inside. At the last moment, they managed to escape the flames by throwing themselves into the icy waters of a nearby river. But when they turned back, all that was left of the research station was a smoldering wreckage. Tanaka's years of work, all those samples, all that data, had turned to ash. Later that night, in the safety of a cave on the riverbank, the two men, covered in soot and mud, looked at each other in the flickering light of the fire. And Gideon confessed everything. The consortium, the dusk moth, that biological murder, everything, he told that horrified young man. Now, he said, they are after us. They will hunt us both down to close all the loose ends. Tanaka was in shock, but at the same time, an anger, a desire for justice was awakening in him. Do you have proof? He asked. Everything is burned. Not everything, Gideon said. 20 years ago, with the crushing guilt he felt after committing that crime, he had prepared an insurance policy. He had copied his original research data, the entire genetic map of the dusk moth, all his correspondence with the consortium, onto an encrypted radiation and all external effects resistant drive. And he had buried that drive in a place where no one would ever find it, inside a protected giant bat cave in the deepest parts of his own national park. Their only hope was to retrieve that drive before Reed's team found them. This was their last, most dangerous journey. They infiltrated his own park, this time not as a protector, but as a fugitive. At night, they advanced like a ghost on those familiar paths in the wilderness. But they were not alone. Reed's team, with thermal imaging devices and drones, was hunting them from above, from the sky. Finally, they reached the mouth of that giant echoing bat cave. The inside was filled with the whisper of millions of wings, the smell of ammonia and earth. Gideon, with the flashlight in his hand, advanced through the labyrinthine corridors of the cave and reached that secret chamber. From under 20 years of soil, he took out that small metal box. Just as they thought they had won, armed silhouettes appeared at the entrance of the cave. Miss Reed and her team had cornered them. "The game is over, Gideon," Reed's cold voice echoed from the walls of the cave. "Give me the drive." This could not turn into a gunfight. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But Gideon had one last card up his sleeve. He knew this cave, this ecosystem, like the back of his hand. He knew that the giant bat colony in the cave was extremely sensitive to a specific ultrasonic frequency. He took out a small modified device, which was normally used to keep animals away, and pressed the button. A high-pitched scream, which the human ear could not hear, but was unbearable for the bats, filled the inside of the cave. And then that apocalypse broke out. The millions of bats sleeping on the ceiling of the cave at the same time rushed towards the entrance of the cave like a flood of panic. It was a dark, screaming tsunami of flesh and bone. Reed's team, in the midst of that chaos, was blinded, overwhelmed, lost their way. And that momentary chaos gave Gideon and Tanaka the time they needed to escape from another secret exit of the cave. Gideon had used nature one last time, this time not to destroy, but to defend, as a weapon. Gideon's data, when combined with Tanaka's last surviving genetic analysis, was leaked to the world. The consortium was exposed and faced with multi-billion-dollar lawsuits, an international scandal. And Gideon did not run anymore. He surrendered to the police. A few years later, Gideon, having served a short sentence for his cooperation, is no longer a park ranger. He's working with Dr. Kenji Tanaka on a new, ambitious project, a breathing program to slowly reintroduce a genetically pure strain of the original Sierra silverwing butterfly to that reclaimed, reprotected valley. At the end of the story, we see his old, wise hands gently hold
one of those beautiful, iridescent winged butterflies. He is no longer destroying a species, he is bringing one back from the dead with his own hands. And in the wing beat of that small, fragile life, he was finding the final, the true redemption of his own soul. Behind every genius, there lies a secret, sometimes the source of that genius, and sometimes a threat to destroy it.